Have you ever noticed how differently you behave when you're completely alone compared to when others are watching? When was the last time you sat in absolute silence without reaching for your phone, without turning on music, without finding some way to fill that void that emerges when it's just you and your thoughts? Right now, as I ask you this question, notice what happens in your body. Feel that subtle tension creeping into your chest, that almost imperceptible urge to look away from this screen, to check a notification, to do anything other than sit with the weight of that question. Your shoulders might tighten, your breathing might become slightly more shallow. You might even feel a strange restlessness, as if something inside you is saying, we don't need to think about this right now. This isn't random. Your psyche is trying to tell you something profound about the nature of your relationship with yourself, something that most people spend their entire lives running from. Most people believe they fear loneliness because they're social beings who require connection to feel alive. They think the ache they feel when alone is simply a need for human contact, for conversation, for the warmth of another person's presence. But Manly P. Hall understood something far more profound, something that cuts to the very core of human psychological development. You don't fear loneliness. You fear what loneliness reveals about who you truly are beneath all the masks, all the performances, all the carefully constructed versions of yourself that you present to the world. The unconscious mind always knows. It recognizes when you're running from yourself, when you're using others as mirrors to avoid looking directly into your own soul, when you're living in what Hall called the great deception of external validation. Your unconscious has been watching, observing, taking notes on every moment you choose distraction over self-reflection. Every time you reach for something outside yourself, rather than turning inward. Think about your typical day. Really examine it with brutal honesty. How many moments exist where you're truly alone with yourself, without any external stimulation? For most people, the answer is terrifying. Almost none. You wake up and what's the first thing you do? Before your feet even touch the floor, you're reaching for your phone. Then it's music while showering, podcasts while getting dressed, radio during the commute. At work, you're surrounded by the constant hum of activity, conversations, deadlines, meetings. During lunch, you're scrolling, reading, consuming something. The commute home brings more audio stimulation. Evening arrives with television, streaming, background noise of any kind to fill the space between your ears. Even when you think you're alone, you're not really alone. You're alone with Netflix, alone with music, alone with the voices of podcasters, or the chatter of talk shows. True solitude, the kind where it's just you and the vast landscape of your inner world, has become as rare as finding a moment of complete darkness in a modern city. But here's what's happening beneath the surface. In the realm of your unconscious mind where the real psychological work occurs, every time you avoid being truly alone with yourself, you're unconsciously communicating to your psyche that who you are in silence is somehow dangerous, unacceptable, or insufficient. This isn't a conscious decision. You're not sitting there thinking, I must avoid my authentic self at all costs. Instead, it's become an automatic pattern, so deeply ingrained that you don't even notice it anymore. But your unconscious mind notices everything. It's incredibly sophisticated, recognizing patterns and forming beliefs based on your consistent behaviors. It begins to form a devastating conclusion. If I always need something outside myself to feel okay, then what's inside must be lacking, broken, or frightening. Manly Paul revealed that this pattern creates what he called the divided self, a psychological state where your authentic nature becomes increasingly foreign to your conscious awareness. You begin to know yourself only through the responses of others, only through external achievements, only through constant activity and stimulation. Think about how this shows up in your relationships. You might find yourself becoming whoever you think others need you to be. In romantic partnerships, you unconsciously morph into the ideal companion, emphasizing the qualities your partner seems to appreciate while suppressing the parts of yourself that might create conflict or disapproval. With friends, you become the entertainer, the supporter, the reliable one, Whatever role seems to maintain harmony and connection. At work, you wear a professional mask that feels increasingly removed from your authentic self. You speak in ways that don't feel natural, make decisions based on what will be well received rather than what feels genuinely right. Suppress your real opinions in favor of politically safe responses. Notice how exhausting this is. By the end of most days, you feel drained not just from external demands, but from the constant internal work of managing all these different versions of yourself. It's like running multiple computer programs simultaneously. Eventually, the system starts to slow down, to overheat, to malfunction. The unconscious mind observes all of this adaptive behavior and begins to construct what Hall called the false personality, a composite of all these external adaptations, a collection of borrowed traits and learned responses that has little connection to your authentic nature. But underneath all of this performance, your true self remains. It doesn't disappear, doesn't get destroyed by neglect. It waits, it watches, and sometimes it sends up signals of its presence that we experience as loneliness, restlessness, or that vague sense that something essential is missing from our lives. This is why solitude feels so threatening. In silence, without external validation or distraction, the false personality begins to dissolve like sugar in water. The roles you play, the masks you wear, the adapted versions of yourself that feel so solid and real in social situations, they start to feel flimsy, insubstantial, almost embarrassingly artificial when there's no audience to perform. And in that dissolution, you're confronted with aspects of yourself that you've been unconsciously avoiding. Not necessarily negative aspects, but aspects that feel unfamiliar, uncontrolled, unpredictable. The person you are when no one is watching, when there are no expectations to meet, no roles to fulfill, no image to maintain. Your psyche is trying to tell you something crucial. The loneliness you feel isn't because you need more people in your life. It's because you've become estranged from yourself. Manly P. Hall understood that every human being carries within them what would later be called the shadow, those aspects of our personality that we've learned to suppress, deny, or project onto others. But Hall's insight went deeper than simple psychological theory. He recognized that the shadow isn't just composed of negative traits we've rejected, but also positive potentials we've been too afraid to embody. When you're alone without the familiar scripts of social interaction to guide you, these unlived aspects of yourself begin to surface. And this is absolutely terrifying because it means confronting not just who you are, but who you could become if you had the courage to stop hiding from yourself. Think about the dreams you had as a child, before you learned what was realistic or appropriate. Think about the creative impulses you've suppressed because they didn't fit into your professional image. Consider the bold actions you've talked yourself out of, the authentic expressions of anger, joy, creativity, or love that you've deemed too risky, too much, too revealing. All of these live in your shadow, not as dark, negative forces, but as unlived potential seeking integration into your conscious personality. They represent parts of yourself that you've put into exile, banished to the unconscious, because they didn't fit the narrow definition of who you thought you needed to be to survive and thrive in the world. Notice how your body responds when you consider these suppressed aspects of yourself. There might be a flutter of excitement mixed with fear, a sense of longing combined with resistance. Your chest might feel tight or expansive. You might feel a stirring of energy, or conversely, a deadening numbness. These physical responses are your psyche recognizing parts of itself that have been in exile, calling out for attention, for acknowledgement, for integration. All revealed that when we consistently avoid solitude, we're not just avoiding loneliness, we're avoiding the confrontation with our unlived authenticity. We're avoiding the responsibility that comes with recognizing our fuller potential, because recognizing it means we can no longer pretend we don't have choices about how to live our lives. In relationships, This dynamic shows up as unconscious projection. You might find yourself magnetically attracted to people who embody the qualities you've suppressed in yourself. The confident person draws you in because you've suppressed your own confidence. The creative person fascinates you because you've denied your own creativity. The independent person attracts you because you've abandoned your own autonomy in favor of pleasing others. But here's the profound psychological truth that Hall understood. These attractions aren't really about the other person. They're your psyche trying to show you aspects of yourself that are seeking integration. The qualities you admire in others are often the qualities you've disowned in yourself. This is why relationships can become so psychologically charged, why they can trigger such intense emotions and conflicts. You're not just relating to another person, you're relating to the projected aspects of your own unlived potential. When they disappoint you, when they fail to embody perfectly the qualities you've projected onto them, you experience it as a betrayal not just of your expectations, but of your hopes for your own psychological completion. The false personality thrives on these projections because they allow you to experience your fuller self vicariously, without taking the risk of actually embodying those qualities yourself. You can feel creative through your artist friend, confident through your bold colleague, spiritual through your wise mentor, without ever having to face the terror and responsibility of becoming those things yourself. But projection is always unstable. Other people can't carry your unlived potential forever. Eventually, they will fail to be the perfect containers for your disowned qualities, and you'll be faced with a choice: project onto someone new, or begin the challenging work of reclaiming those qualities for yourself. This is where the architecture of self-avoidance becomes most clear. We've constructed elaborate systems, social, professional, even romantic, that allow us to experience ourselves indirectly, through others, through achievements, through constant external stimulation and validation. We've built what amounts to a psychological fortress around our authentic self, not to protect it, but to avoid having to meet it face to face. The tragedy of this architecture is that it works, at least partially. You can live an entire lifetime without ever having to confront who you truly are beneath all the adaptations and projections. You can stay busy enough, connected enough, stimulated enough to never face the silence where your authentic self waits. But the cost is enormous. The cost is living as a stranger to yourself, never knowing the profound satisfaction of authentic self-expression, never experiencing the deep peace that comes from self-acceptance, never discovering the unique gifts and perspectives that only you can bring to the world. More than that, the cost is a kind of existential loneliness that no amount of social connection can touch. It's the loneliness of being unknown, even to yourself. It's the ache of living a life that feels somehow borrowed, performed, empty at its core despite all the external markers of success and connection. It masquerades as productivity, as social engagement, as responsible living. Your unconscious mind recognizes this emptiness, this fundamental, your authentic self. It sends up signals: restlessness, dissatisfaction, that sense that there must be more to life than this constant performance and consumption. But instead of recognizing alienation, are these signals as invitations to turn inward and finally meet yourself in the silence. Most people interpret them as signs that they need more external stimulation, more achievements, more relationships, more of anything except the one thing that could actually address the root of their longing. But underneath, it's a complex system designed to ensure that you never have to face the most fundamental question of human existence. Who are you when all the externals are stripped away? This question terrifies most people not because the answer is dark or disturbing, but because answering it requires taking full responsibility for their lives. It requires acknowledging that they have far more choice, far more potential, far more power than they've been willing to admit. And with that recognition comes the end of victimhood, the end of blaming circumstances or other people for the shape of their lives, the end of the comfortable unconsciousness that allows them to drift through life without ever having to decide who they really want to be. As we stand at the threshold of understanding this psychological architecture, as we begin to see how thoroughly we've organized our lives around avoiding authentic self encounter, we must ask ourselves, are we ready to begin dismantling these elaborate defenses? Are we prepared to step into the unknown territory of our authentic selves, even if it means leaving behind the familiar comfort of our false personality? The answer to these questions will determine whether we remain trapped in the architecture of self-avoidance, or whether we're ready to begin the profound journey of authentic self-discovery that Manly P. Hall understood to be the true purpose of human psychological development. The moment you decide to face these questions honestly, something profound shifts in your psychological landscape. You begin to recognize that there are actually two completely different types of loneliness operating in your life, and confusing them has kept you trapped in cycles of seeking external solutions to internal problems. What you've been calling loneliness, that restless ache when you're by yourself, that desperate need to fill silence with noise. This isn't true loneliness at all. This is what Manly identified as false loneliness, the discomfort that arises when your false personality begins to dissolve in the absence of external validation and stimulation. True loneliness is something entirely different. True loneliness is the profound disconnection from your authentic self that occurs when you've spent so long being who others need you to be that you've forgotten who you actually are. You can experience true loneliness in a crowded room, surrounded by people who know your name and your history but have never met the person you really are beneath all your adaptations. Right now, think about your closest relationship. How many of these people have ever seen you in complete authenticity? How many have witnessed you without your masks, without your people-pleasing tendencies, without your need to be impressive or likable or appropriate? How many know the parts of you that you've deemed unacceptable, the dreams you've abandoned, the aspects of your personality that you've learned to hide? Notice what comes up in your body as you consider this. You might feel a tightness in your throat, a heaviness in your chest, or perhaps a surprising sense of grief. This physical response is your psyche recognizing the magnitude of how unknown you've allowed yourself to become, even to those closest to you. Manly Hall understood that this type of soul-level isolation is what drives most human suffering. We can surround ourselves with people, fill our calendars with social engagements, maintain constant communication through calls and messages, and still feel fundamentally alone because we're connecting from our false personality rather than our authentic self. The false personality is skilled at creating what feels like connection, but it's actually creating sophisticated forms of performance. Even in intimate relationships, you find yourself unconsciously editing your responses, moderating your emotions, presenting carefully curated versions of your thoughts and feelings. You become so practiced at this that you might not even realize you're doing it anymore. But your unconscious mind recognizes the difference between authentic connection and performative connection. It knows when you're being seen for who you really are versus being appreciated for who you're pretending to be. And this knowing creates a persistent underlying anxiety, a sense that you're always at risk of being discovered, of having someone see through your carefully maintained facade. This is why so many people report feeling lonely even in long-term relationships or marriages. They've spent so much energy maintaining their acceptable persona that they've lost contact with their authentic self and therefore can't offer genuine intimacy to their partner. They're in relationship, but the real person, the one with unprocessed emotions, unspoken dreams, suppressed creativity, hidden fears, remains in isolation. The psychology of authentic emergence begins when you recognize this distinction and make a conscious choice to prioritize connection with your authentic self over comfort with your false personality. This choice requires extraordinary courage because it means willingly stepping into the unknown territory of who you are when you're not trying to be anything for anyone. Manly Hall taught that this step represents what ancient mystery schools called initiation, the voluntary death of the false self, and the birth of authentic. But unlike the dramatic initiations depicted in stories and films, this psychological initiation happens in the quiet moments when you choose to sit with yourself in complete honesty rather than reaching for familiar distraction. When was the last time you sat in silence for more than a few minutes without feeling compelled to do something, to fix something, to entertain yourself with thoughts about the past or future? When did you last allow yourself to simply exist without agenda, without trying to figure anything out or solve any problems? This kind of purposeful solitude is radically different from the lonely isolation that most people feel. Sacred solitude is a conscious choice to meet yourself fully, to become curious about who you are beneath all your strategies for managing other people's perception. It's an act of profound self respect, a recognition that your authentic self is worth knowing. But the moment you sit in genuine solitude, your false personality will begin to protest. It will generate thoughts about all the things you should be doing instead. It will create urgency around tasks that suddenly seem crucial. It will produce anxiety about relationships that need tending, work that needs completing, responsibilities that can't wait. Notice how seductive these thoughts can be. They feel so reasonable, so responsible. But Hall understood that this is the false personality's survival mechanism. It has built its entire existence around being needed, being busy, being useful to others. Authentic solitude threatens its very foundation because it doesn't require any of those roles. Your body might respond to genuine solitude with physical restlessness. You might feel the urge to check your phone, to clean something, to suddenly remember important calls you need to make. You might experience what feels like anxiety but is actually the false personality's fear of dissolution. This is where most people retreat. They interpret these uncomfortable sensations as signs that solitude isn't good for them, that they're meant to be social creatures who need constant interaction and stimulation. But Hall taught that this discomfort is actually the first sign that you're approaching authentic territory, the psychological border between who you've learned to be and who you actually are. The initiation of authentic emergence requires that you develop what he called the observer self, a part of your consciousness that can witness the protests of the false personality without being controlled by them. This observer notices the thoughts, feels the physical sensations, acknowledges the emotional responses, but doesn't automatically obey them. As you strengthen this observing capacity, something remarkable begins to happen. In the silence, after the initial waves of resistance subside, you start to encounter aspects of yourself that feel both foreign and deeply familiar. You might notice creative impulses that you haven't felt in years. You might become aware of opinions and perspectives that you've never expressed to anyone. You might feel emotions that you've learned to suppress because they didn't fit your image of who you're supposed to be. These encounters can be overwhelming because they reveal how much of yourself you've kept hidden, even from your own conscious awareness. You might feel grief for all the years you've spent disconnected from these parts of yourself. You might feel anger at the conditioning that taught you to suppress your authenticity. You might feel fear about what it would mean to actually embody these rediscovered aspects of your personality. But underneath these challenging emotions, there's often a profound sense of recognition, of coming home to yourself. Your body might relax in ways it hasn't in years. Your breathing might become deeper and more natural. You might feel a sense of expansion, as if you're remembering how to take up your full space in the world. Manly P. Hall understood that this recognition connects us to something larger than our individual psychology. He taught that when we encounter our authentic self, we're also connecting with what he called archetypal patterns, universal aspects of human experience that transcend personal history and cultural conditioning. These archetypes aren't abstract concepts but lived patterns of energy and meaning that have shaped human psychology across cultures and centuries. When you connect with your authentic creativity, you're touching the universal creator archetype. When you access your genuine strength, you're embodying the warrior. When you feel your natural compassion, you're expressing the healer. This is why authentic self-encounter often feels both intensely personal and mysteriously universal. You're not just meeting your individual personality, you're connecting with timeless patterns of human potential that have been waiting to express themselves through your unique life circumstance. But here's where the psychology becomes particularly challenging. As you begin to recognize these authentic aspects of yourself, you also become aware of how different they are from the person you've been presenting to the world. The gap between your authentic self and your adapted self becomes impossible to ignore. You might realize that your authentic self is more creative than your professional image allows, more sensitive than your tough exterior suggests, more intelligent than your self-deprecating humor implies, or more powerful than your people-pleasing tendencies reveal. This recognition can create what feels like an identity crisis, because it means acknowledging that you've been living as a fraction of who you actually are. Your relationships begin to feel strained, because you're no longer content to connect from your false personality. You want to be known and appreciated for who you really are, but expressing your authentic self means risking the loss of relationships that were built on your adapted persona. This can feel terrifying, because these relationships, however inauthentic, have provided the security and validation that your false personality requires. This is the point where many people retreat back into their familiar patterns of self-avoidance. The price of authenticity feels too high, the risk too great. It seems easier to continue living as a modified version of yourself than to face the unknown consequences of genuine self-expression. But Hall taught that this psychological crossroads is actually the most crucial moment in human development. It's the place where you choose between a life of comfortable unconsciousness and the challenging but profoundly meaningful path of authentic self-realization. The unconscious mind has been observing all of this internal development, and it begins to shift its fundamental assessment of your worth and capability. Instead of the message "you need others to feel complete," it starts to communicate something radically different. You are worth knowing. You have value independent of others' approval. Your authentic expression is a gift to the world. This shift doesn't happen overnight, and it's rarely smooth or linear. You might find yourself moving back and forth between authentic expression and familiar adaptation, waters of genuineness, while keeping one foot firmly planted in the safety of your false. But gradually, as you accumulate experiences of being accepted for who you really are, as you discover that authentic expression often creates deeper and more satisfying connections than performative behavior, your confidence in your authentic self begins to grow. You start to notice that people respond differently to you when you're being genuine. Some relationships may indeed fade as you stop providing whatever role you were unconsciously playing, but new connections often emerge with people who appreciate your authenticity. More importantly, you begin to experience the profound satisfaction of being known and valued for who you actually are, rather than who you've learned to be. Your creative capacity expands because you're no longer censoring your ideas and impulses through the filter of acceptability. Your emotional range deepens because you're allowing yourself to feel and express the full spectrum of human experience. Your intuitive abilities strengthen because you're trusting your internal guidance rather than constantly looking outside yourself for direction. But perhaps most significantly, you begin to develop what Hall called internal validation, the capacity to know your own worth, independent of external feedback. This doesn't mean becoming indifferent to others' responses, but rather developing a stable sense of self that doesn't require constant confirmation from outside sources. This internal validation becomes the foundation for all healthy relationships, because you're no longer unconsciously using others to feel good about yourself. You can connect with people from a place of fullness rather than need, offering genuine care and attention without the hidden agenda of getting something back to maintain your self-worth. The process of authentic emergence also reveals the psychological function of loneliness that most people never understand. That ache you've been feeling when alone isn't a sign that something is wrong with you. It's your authentic self calling out for recognition and integration. It's your psyche trying to guide you home to yourself. As you learn to interpret this signal accurately, loneliness transforms from something to be avoided into valuable information about your psychological state. When you feel that familiar ache, instead of immediately reaching for distraction or company, you can ask yourself, what part of me is feeling unseen or unexpressed right now? What aspect of my authentic self is trying to emerge? This question changes everything because it shifts your relationship with discomfort from avoidance to curiosity. Instead of seeing difficult emotions as problems to be solved, you begin to recognize them as messengers carrying important information about your psychological development. The unconscious mind responds to this shift by becoming an ally rather than a source of anxiety. It recognizes that you're finally listening to its communications, finally taking seriously the wisdom it's been trying to share. The internal conflicts that once felt overwhelming begin to resolve as you stop fighting against your authentic nature and start honoring its guidance. This is the territory where authentic psychological transformation becomes possible, not through learning new techniques or strategies, but through the profound act of becoming intimate with who you actually are beneath all your adaptation. As this intimacy develops, you naturally begin to express more of your authentic self in the world, and the artificial barriers between your inner and outer life start to dissolve. The question that emerges from this understanding is no longer how can I avoid loneliness, but rather how can I use my capacity for solitude to deepen my relationship with my authentic self. This shift in questioning opens the door to the final stage of this psychological transformation, learning to live from your authentic center rather than your adaptive strategy. When you finally make peace with using solitude as a pathway to self-knowledge, rather than something to escape from, you enter what Manly Hall called the alchemy of self-acceptance, a profound psychological transformation, where the very qualities you've spent years rejecting about yourself become the source of your greatest strength and creativity. This transformation doesn't happen through positive thinking or forced self-love mantras. It occurs through the simple but revolutionary act of meeting yourself with genuine curiosity instead of constant judgment. What would happen right now if you stopped trying to fix, improve, or modify yourself, and instead became genuinely interested in understanding who you are in this moment? Notice what shifts in your body when you consider approaching yourself with curiosity rather than criticism. Your shoulders might drop slightly, your breathing might become more natural, there might be a subtle softening around your heart, a sense of relief that you've been carrying without even realizing. This shift from self-improvement to self-understanding is the cornerstone of authentic psychological development. Your unconscious mind has been waiting for this moment, the moment when you stop treating your authentic self as a problem to be solved and start recognizing it as a mystery worth exploring. The false personality has built its entire structure around the belief that you're fundamentally flawed and need constant modification to be acceptable. But as you spend more time in authentic solitude, you begin to recognize that this belief is not only false, but actively harmful to your psychological development. You start to see that the qualities you've been trying to suppress often contain the seeds of your greatest gift. Your sensitivity, which you've learned to see as weakness, might actually be a profound capacity for empathy and intuitive understanding. Your intensity, which you've been told is too much, might be the very force that allows you to create meaningful change in the world. Your tendency toward solitude, which you've interpreted as antisocial behavior, might be your psyche's natural way of accessing wisdom and creativity. Manly P. Hall understood that this recognition that our supposed flaws often contain our hidden strengths represents a fundamental shift in consciousness. Instead of trying to eliminate aspects of yourself that don't fit cultural expectations, You begin the much more sophisticated work of learning how to express these qualities in ways that serve both your authentic development and your connections with others. This is what he meant by psychological alchemy, the transformation of psychological lead into gold, the conversion of what you've seen as your worst qualities into your most valuable asset. But this transformation requires something that most people find terrifying: the willingness to accept yourself completely, including the parts that feel messy, complicated, or socially unacceptable. Think about the last time you felt truly ashamed of something about yourself. Maybe it was an emotional reaction that felt too intense, a desire that seemed inappropriate, a thought that conflicted with your self-image, or a behavior that didn't match your values. Right now, what would it feel like to approach that shameful aspect of yourself with genuine compassion and curiosity instead of judgment and rejection? Your body might resist this idea initially. There might be tightness in your chest or stomach, a voice in your head insisting that shame serves an important function in keeping you socially acceptable. But Hall taught that shame about our authentic nature is one of the most destructive forces in human psychology, because it creates an internal war between who we are and who we think we should be. This internal war consumes enormous amounts of psychological energy. Think about how exhausting it is to constantly monitor your thoughts, emotions, and impulses to make sure they're appropriate. Consider how much mental energy you spend trying to feel differently than you actually feel, trying to want different things than you actually want, trying to be someone other than who you actually are. As you learn to accept yourself more completely, not as a one-time decision but as an ongoing practice, this internal conflict begins to resolve. The energy that was previously consumed by self-rejection becomes available for creative expression, authentic connection, and meaningful contribution to the world. This is when you begin to notice the unmistakable signs of psychological evolution. Your relationship with your own emotions transforms completely. Instead of seeing difficult feelings as evidence that something is wrong with you, you start to recognize them as information about your current psychological state and guidance about what needs attention or adjustment in your life. When anger arises, instead of immediately suppressing it or feeling guilty about it, you become curious about what boundary might need to be established or what value might be under threat. When sadness emerges, rather than rushing to fix it or distract yourself from it, you allow it to inform you about what matters to you, what you might be grieving, or what transition you might be moving through. This emotional sophistication creates a profound shift in how you navigate relationships. You stop expecting others to manage your emotional states for you, and you stop taking responsibility for managing theirs. You can be present with someone's pain without trying to fix it. You can share your own struggles without needing others to solve them for you. Notice how different this feels from the way most people relate to emotions, both their own and others. Most relationships involve unconscious agreements about emotional management. I'll pretend to be happier than I am so you don't have to feel uncomfortable, and you'll pretend my problems aren't as serious as they are so I don't have to face them fully. But when you develop emotional authenticity, these unconscious agreements become impossible to maintain. You start expressing what you actually feel, rather than what you think others want to hear. You stop pretending that everything is fine when it isn't, and you stop expecting others to pretend for your comfort. This shift can initially create turbulence in your relationships, because people have become accustomed to your false personality and its predictable emotional response. Some people might feel uncomfortable with your increased authenticity, because it challenges their own patterns of emotional avoidance. But something remarkable happens over time. The relationships that can adapt to your increased authenticity become dramatically deeper and more satisfying. Instead of connecting through shared performance, you begin connecting through shared humanity, the messy, complicated, beautiful reality of being human. Your capacity for genuine intimacy expands because you're no longer protecting others from your authentic self or protecting yourself from theirs. You can sit with someone in their pain without needing to fix it. You can share your joy without diminishing it to make others comfortable. You can express disagreement without it threatening the fundamental connection. This transformation in relationships reflects a deeper change in how you understand love itself. The false personality believes that love is something you earn through being acceptable, helpful, or entertain. But as you develop authentic self-acceptance, you begin to understand that love is actually your natural response to being genuinely known and accepted. When someone sees and accepts your authentic self, including the parts you've learned to hide, love arises spontaneous, not as an emotion you have to generate or maintain, but as the natural result of genuine connection. This understanding transforms not only how you relate to others, but how you relate to yourself. You begin to experience self-love, not as something you have to practice or cultivate, but as the natural outcome of self-acceptance. The more completely you know and accept yourself, the more naturally love flows toward yourself and others. This shift creates what Manly Paul called internal validation, the capacity to know your own worth, independent of external confirmation. This doesn't mean becoming indifferent to others' responses or isolating yourself from feedback. Instead, it means developing a sense of your own value that doesn't collapse when someone disapproves of you or inflate when someone praises you. Internal validation becomes the foundation for authentic creative expression because you're no longer filtering your ideas and impulses through the constant question, will this be acceptable to others? Instead, you can ask much more interesting questions. Does this feel true to who I am? Does this express something important that wants to emerge through me? Does this contribute something meaningful to the world? Your creative capacity expands exponentially because you're accessing the full range of your psychological resources, rather than just the narrow band that your false personality deemed safe. You might rediscover artistic abilities you abandoned in childhood. You might find yourself drawn to forms of expression that previously felt too risky or exposing. You might develop solutions to problems that your adapted thinking could never have conceived. But perhaps most significantly, you begin to understand your life itself as a creative expression, an ongoing work of art, where every choice, every relationship, every response to challenge becomes an opportunity to express your authentic nature more fully. This understanding transforms how you approach major life decisions. Instead of choosing based primarily on security, social expectations, or what will make others happy, you begin to include the crucial question of authenticity. Which choice allows me to express and develop my authentic self more completely? This doesn't mean becoming selfish or inconsiderate of others' needs. Rather, it means recognizing that your authentic contribution to the world, the unique gift that only you can offer, emerges through honoring your genuine nature, not through suppressing it in favor of what seems more acceptable. As this integration deepens, notice that your relationship with solitude has transformed completely. What once felt like loneliness, that desperate ache when alone, has evolved into what you now recognize as sacred time for self-connection and creative incubation. You find yourself actually looking forward to periods of solitude because they've become opportunities for psychological and spiritual nourishment rather than experiences to be endured. In these quiet moments, instead of feeling empty or restless, you often feel a sense of fullness and possibility. Your mind becomes more creative, your intuition more accessible, your sense of purpose more clear. You start to understand why so many wisdom traditions have emphasized solitude as essential for psychological and spiritual development. But the most profound transformation occurs in how you understand your place in the larger human community. As you become more authentically yourself, you paradoxically become more connected to others, rather than more isolated. This happens because authenticity connects you to universal human experiences that transcend cultural and personal difference. When you allow yourself to feel your fear fully, you connect with the universal human experience of vulnerability. When you express your creativity authentically, you touch something that resonates across individual difference. When you love from your genuine nature, rather than your adapted strategies, you access a quality of connection that speaks to the deepest part of human experience. Manly P. Hall taught that this is how individual psychological development serves collective human evolution. As you become more authentically yourself, you contribute to the collective pool of human consciousness. Your willingness to face your own psychological shadows makes it easier for others to face theirs. Your courage to express your authentic nature gives others permission to access their own genuineness. This is why the work of authentic self-development is never purely personal. Every person who chooses the challenging path of psychological authenticity creates more space in the collective consciousness for others to do the same. Your individual healing becomes a contribution to collective healing. As you integrate these understandings more fully, your relationship with what you once called loneliness continues to evolve. You begin to recognize that the ache you felt when alone was never actually about needing other people. It was about needing to come home to yourself. It was your authentic self calling out for recognition, integration, and expression. Now, when you feel that familiar stirring in solitude, instead of interpreting it as a problem to be solved through external connection, you can recognize it as valuable information about some aspect of yourself that wants attention or development. You might realize that you're feeling creative and need to make time for artistic expression. You might recognize that you're processing grief and need to allow yourself to feel it fully. You might understand that you're receiving intuitive guidance about a life decision and need to listen carefully to your inner wisdom. This transformation allows you to use periods of aloneness as opportunities for what Hall called conscious self-communion, deliberate dialogue with your deeper wisdom, intentional connection with your authentic nature, purposeful exploration of your psychological and spiritual development. The quality of your relationships with others transforms as well because you're relating from fullness rather than emptiness, from self-knowledge rather than self-avoidance, from authentic expression rather than performative adaptation. You can offer genuine presence to others because you're genuinely present with yourself. You can provide real support because you've learned to support yourself through your own challenges. You can love others authentically because you've developed an authentic relationship with yourself. Standing at the completion of this psychological transformation, you can look back and see how profoundly your relationship with yourself and others has changed. The person who once feared loneliness because it meant confronting uncomfortable truths about yourself has evolved into someone who values solitude as an opportunity for continued growth and self-discovery. The anxiety about being alone has transformed into appreciation for the wisdom that emerges in silence. The desperate need for external validation has evolved into stable self-acceptance that enhances rather than competes with your connections to others. Waters of genuineness while keeping one foot firmly planted in the safety of your false. But gradually, as you accumulate experiences of being accepted for who you really are, as you discover that authentic expression often creates deeper and more satisfying connections than performative behavior, your confidence in your authentic self begins to grow. You start to notice that people respond differently to you when you're being genuine. Some relationships may indeed fade as you stop providing whatever role you were unconsciously playing, but new connections often emerge with people who appreciate your authenticity. More importantly, you begin to experience the profound satisfaction of being known and valued for who you actually are, rather than who you've learned to be. Your creative capacity expands because you're no longer censoring your ideas and impulses through the filter of acceptability. Your emotional range deepens because you're allowing yourself to feel and express the full spectrum of human experience. Your intuitive abilities strengthen because you're trusting your internal guidance rather than constantly looking outside yourself for direction. But perhaps most significantly, you begin to develop what Hall called internal validation, the capacity to know your own worth, independent of external feedback. This doesn't mean becoming indifferent to others' responses, but rather developing a stable sense of self that doesn't require constant confirmation from outside sources. This internal validation becomes the foundation for all healthy relationships because you're no longer unconsciously using others to feel good about yourself. You can connect with people from a place of fullness rather than need, offering genuine care and attention without the hidden agenda of getting something back to maintain your self-worth. The process of authentic emergence also reveals the psychological function of loneliness that most people never understand. That ache you've been feeling when alone isn't a sign that something is wrong with you. It's your authentic self calling out for recognition and integration. It's your psyche trying to guide you home to yourself. As you learn to interpret this signal accurately, loneliness transforms from something to be avoided into valuable information about your psychological state. When you feel that familiar ache, instead of immediately reaching for distraction or company, you can ask yourself, what part of me is feeling unseen or unexpressed right now? What aspect of my authentic self is trying to emerge? This question changes everything because it shifts your relationship with discomfort from avoidance to curiosity. Instead of seeing difficult emotions as problems to be solved, you begin to recognize them as messengers carrying important information about your psychological development. The unconscious mind responds to this shift by becoming an ally rather than a source of anxiety. It recognizes that you're finally listening to its communications, finally taking seriously the wisdom it's been trying to share. The internal conflicts that once felt overwhelming begin to resolve as you stop fighting against your authentic nature and start honoring its guidance. This is the territory where authentic psychological transformation becomes possible, not through learning new techniques or strategies, but through the profound act of becoming intimate with who you actually are beneath all your adaptation. As this intimacy develops, you naturally begin to express more of your authentic self in the world, and the artificial barriers between your inner and outer life start to dissolve. The question that emerges from this understanding is no longer how can I avoid loneliness, but rather how can I use my capacity for solitude to deepen my relationship with my authentic self. This shift in questioning opens the door to the final stage of this psychological transformation, learning to live from your authentic center rather than your adaptive strategy. When you finally make peace with using solitude as a pathway to self-knowledge, rather than something to escape from, you enter what Manly Paul called the alchemy of self-acceptance, a profound psychological transformation where the very qualities you've spent years rejecting about yourself become the source of your greatest strength and creativity. This transformation doesn't happen through positive thinking or forced self-love mantras. It occurs through the simple but revolutionary act of meeting yourself with genuine curiosity instead of constant judgment. What would happen right now if you stopped trying to fix, improve, or modify yourself and instead became genuinely interested in understanding who you are in this moment? Notice what shifts in your body when you consider approaching yourself with curiosity rather than criticism. Your shoulders might drop slightly, your breathing might become more natural, there might be a subtle softening around your heart, a sense of relief that you've been carrying without even realizing. This shift from self-improvement to self-understanding is the cornerstone of authentic psychological development. Your unconscious mind has been waiting for this moment, the moment when you stop treating your authentic self as a problem to be solved and start recognizing it as a mystery worth exploring. The false personality has built its entire structure around the belief that you're fundamentally flawed and need constant modification to be acceptable. But as you spend more time in authentic solitude, you begin to recognize that this belief is not only false, but actively harmful to your psychological development. You start to see that the qualities you've been trying to suppress often contain the seeds of your greatest gift. Your sensitivity, which you've learned to see as weakness, might actually be a profound capacity for empathy and intuitive understanding. Your intensity, which you've been told is too much, might be the very force that allows you to create meaningful change in the world. Your tendency towards solitude, which you've interpreted as antisocial behavior, might be your psyche's natural way of accessing wisdom and creativity.